Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the December webinar of the Phi Tau Sigma Fall or 2024-2025 webinar series. We are happy to have you here today for our live webinar or later at a recorded webinar that can be found on our YouTube page. My name is Elizabeth Grasso-Kelly, and I'm the current president of Phi Tau Sigma and the past chair of the program committee, which is now headed by Dr. Fan Ben Kong. We are pleased to offer this webinar today to our members and guests. So for the earlier this fall, we had a series of webinars that we kicked off with a novel 3D food printing approach to generate micronutrient delivery systems by Dr. Ale Tugalari, and then we had Dr. Tim Duncan and Dr. Scott Coffin presenting on microplastics and nanoplastics in October. In November, we had Dr. Joe Regenstein with Writing with Intent to Submit a Peer-Reviewed Paper. In this month, we're offering you a really timely webinar on abstract preparation and best practices for presentations. The first 3 webinars can be found on our YouTube page, and I will be posting today's webinar as soon as possible. So today's live 1-hour presentation will cover best practices and suggestions for developing an abstract, the importance of using effective visuals to create compelling presentations, DEI considerations for presentation preparation, and following competition and presentation guidelines in knowing your audience. Dr. Matthew Moore is an associate professor at UMass Amherst, and he'll be presenting on the resources for developing an abstract. Dr. Ogechukwu Tasie, an associate for student engagement and success and adjunct faculty within the Department of Food and Animal Sciences at Alabama A&M University, will be presenting on DEI considerations. Sloane Stoufer, who is a recent PhD graduate at UMass Amherst, will present on DEI considerations and for some presentation preparation, apologies. And Dr. Claire Zoellner, Director of Data Science at iFoodDS, will present on following competition presentation guidelines and knowing your audience. Special thanks today to the Student Relations Committee for organizing this event. Our speakers today, first up, we'll have Dr. Moore, an associate professor and Eric A. Decker Scholar at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He received his PhD in food science with minors in biotech and food safety from North Carolina State University, and his Bachelor of Science from food science from Cornell University. His research focuses on food safety microbiology, especially foodborne viruses. Our second speaker today is Dr. Tasie, who is an associate for student engagement and success and adjunct faculty within the Department of Food and Animal Sciences at Alabama A&M University. She received both her Master of Science and PhD degrees from Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University. Our third speaker, I'd like to thank Dr. Sloane Stoufer. I apologize, I don't have your picture on the screen, but she recently stepped in due to a conflict. She is a recent PhD graduate and NIFA predoctoral fellow at the University of Massachusetts Amherst within the Department of Food Science. I apologize, I don't have your undergraduate or other degrees, but please feel free to share those whenever you present. And then our last speaker today is Dr. Zoellner, who is the Director of Data Science at iFoodDS. And she received her PhD in Food Science and Technology from Cornell University and her BS in Food Science and Human Nutrition from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Zoellner completed her postdoctoral research at Cornell University prior to joining iFoodDS. Prior to her current role as she served as food safety scientist and product manager. So at this time, I'd like to hand the screen over to Dr. Moore to begin our presentations. We have a series of presentations today who will be building on each other. So please share hold your questions to the end. At that time, you can either put them into the chat and we'll answer them in the chat, or you can come off mute. Thank you.
All right, so can you guys see my screen here?
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint version.
Sweet. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to talk. So and the introduction, Elizabeth, that was great. I'm going to talk about abstracts and some of the resources and tips related to abstracts. in the context of preparation for publications as well as conferences. So abstracts, at least I've found personally, can be one of the things that's the most difficult to do well in terms of scientific publishing, as well as coming up with conferences and grant applications, because it can be very difficult with a lot of the science that we do to distill it down to just a few words, right? So if anybody's putting in abstracts around now for poster presentations coming in the summer, it can be very difficult to try and get all of the complexities of your research down into, the word limit of 250 words, something like that. But that said, even though they are very difficult to do, they are extremely important, which I think a lot of us sort of intuitively understand, right? Like these are the first things that people are going to see when they're scrolling, to decide whether or not to click into your paper or to read it or to cite your paper. So abstracts are extremely important. I know we may have a number of students here observing this seminar. So these abstracts can also be really important in terms of awards and whether or not you're chosen as a finalist. So I know a number of scientific conferences, usually the abstract is what's being evaluated when you get chosen to be a finalist for a poster competition or a technical talk competition. So abstracts can be incredibly important for that. As they are for articles as well. These are usually the only pieces of an article, if it's behind a paywall, that are actually visible to people when they click into your article. And then these, abstracts are also important for other applications as well, for internal grants within companies, as well as extramural grants for government agencies in the form of summaries. So abstracts are extremely important, and it can be really, really difficult to do these, at least from my experience. And this is because, of the complexity of the work that we tend to do. It can be really, really difficult to summarize a lot of the really complicated concepts into just a few words within, the word limit that you're given. And so I found, at least when I was starting out as a student, this was the thing that I struggled the most with, because I tended to write very flowery language and really try and get every possible detail of my research into an abstract, and you'd always run up against the word limit. But I would say over time, after years and years of experience, you eventually get better at it. So practice kind of makes perfect with being able to write really good abstracts. There are many different formats that abstracts can sort of take. And a lot of them will be eventually things that you need to do no matter where you end up in terms of your career once you end up graduating with your degree. In terms of scientific publishing with abstracts, you can generally see sort of two different formats. So there's a structured abstract where you sort of break down the abstract into sort of little mini summary versions of the actual structure of your paper. So the background, the methods, the results, and then the conclusions and broader significance. And then there's also unstructured abstracts, which essentially use the same sort of sentence level format, but you don't actually break it up into formal subsections. And usually you'll see these range from 200 to 350 words in terms of their word limit, which isn't a lot in terms of being able to summarize an entire scientific article's worth of content. So it can become really, really challenging. So some advice that I sort of have for abstracts is I always, when writing a scientific article, like to write these last, because after you've written and really revised the article and synthesized all of your thoughts, it becomes a lot easier to sort of extract the essence of what you're trying to convey with the article and what the overall purpose of the article was. So I always encourage people to write the abstract last, after you've already sort of refined and pretty much have the final version of your full article written. The abstract should, in theory, be able to stand alone in some sense, as a surrogate for the paper to provide just the larger, broader scale takeaways. And again, as there might be students here with very complicated, research questions that they're doing in terms of their projects, it can be very difficult to really convey everything that you really want to in just 250 words. In terms of the specific structure of an abstract, it's essentially a mini version of the paper. So you have your intro and background, your aims, your objectives, methods that you used in a broader sense, the results that you get, and then sort of a discussion and conclusion section. So with your intro and background, I found that this can be really complicated to do, and it can be very difficult, especially when you're starting out, because there's a lot of background information that usually when you're doing sort of a project, there's a lot of basis information or foundational information that you want to convey, and trying to choose what specifically you can do so that it's cohesive enough that somebody who's just sort of outside your field can approach it and understand what you're talking about can be really, really difficult. So this is something I think, especially over time, that you eventually get better at, but it can be really a bit of a challenge. One thing that I do notice, especially a lot of times with students when you get started, is you can spend a lot of time providing a lot of information about background, but then sort of use up a lot of words on it without actually ever sort of stating what the specific gap in knowledge is that your actual project or paper is addressing. And that's one of the things that's maybe the most important to include in your background. So I would make sure to really convey that, what is the specific gap in knowledge, or what's the unanswered question that your paper is actually going to answer, and make that very, very clear in the first few sentences. Similarly, what is the actual purpose of the research that you're presenting, and making that very clear in the abstract. One of the challenges, another challenge that can be really apparent with abstracts, is what specific methods or assays that you use to list. And this usually I found is the area where you can cut a lot of words and just be very, very broad. Thinking again more to what is the gap you're addressing, and then how are you addressing that methodologically, just through very broad statements. Similarly, results can be very difficult too, right? Because all of the research that we all do generates lots of numbers, and it can be very difficult to try and fit everything that you want to convey into just a few sentences. So some sort of tips for that I've found has been trying to use ranges or just broader trends in terms of the overall data that you observed in the abstract. And then if people are really interested, then they can really dig into, the actual paper itself to get all of the other information. When you're starting out, it can be very difficult to not fall into the let's list every possible single number or every possible single result that we have in the abstract. But it does need to be done in terms of really reducing how much you talk about that. Similarly, discussion and conclusions, really thinking of the broader overall trends and implications of your work and where they fit in sort of the gap in knowledge that you're addressing. Is really important, and what the broader, larger global takeaways of your work are can be a little bit difficult initially to do, but it is something that you need to convey. And then similarly, you'll also have keywords and a running title, usually when you're going to submit for a paper. Usually those are a little bit easier than actually getting a proper abstract together. So in terms of tips for, writing an effective abstract, again, like really to me, it all boils down to trying to get the word count down so that you can convey the essence of the paper without going over the words. So again, I think really leaning on ranges or overall trends from the values or results that you observe can really help cut things down. Trying to avoid phrasing. So I found initially when I started as a student, I would use a lot of transitional phrases, which are great in the context of writing a paper and helping with the flow of a paper, but using transitional phrases like furthermore, surprisingly, interestingly, things like that, you can cut a lot of that out for an abstract, because it really just needs to be bare bones language to just directly convey what you actually observed, to really cut the word count down. Yeah, and then if all else fails, a lot of times when you go to submit with word count, if you remove spaces between plus minus and the percentage and symbols, you can cut a few words that way, but that's usually a last resort. So what are sort of the resources that you can use, especially if you're getting started out and this is your first sort of abstract that you're writing? I would say leaning on your advisor, your research advisor, is really a good first step. And then pay attention to, sort of the changes that they make with track changes. You may pick up on certain tricks, like over the years, you start learning ways to rephrase sentences so that they're more direct. That can really help you out with really cutting down the words and directly conveying an idea. And then also learning by example. So asking your advisor for example abstracts from past students can also really, really help, and start trying to mimic the structure and types of tone and language they use can really be helpful. Similarly, leaning on your peers as well. So senior lab members for abstracts, they're a great resource. I've been lucky to have really, really great students, Sloane being one of them, who have already built up a really good sort of supply of really great abstracts as well as poster templates, slide templates. So your peers are a really, really great resource. And then another resource that I don't think many students use as much as they could is your university, college, or library. So I know here at UMass, we have a really, really great group of people at our library, and they actually have lots of resources related to not only abstract preparation, but writing articles, being able to find proper articles. They'll even have specifically knowledgeable staff who may actually be specific to your major. So I kind of took a screenshot here. At UMass, we have a really great librarian, Paulina, who actually works with our food science folks, who you can actually go to and arrange and make meetings with, who can help you not only write an abstract, but can help you with resources on finding really good articles. And then another thing that I've observed, a lot of libraries tend to really be fans and supportive of open source and open format, especially in terms of resources. So I kind of have a link there in the presentation where it'll take you to UMass library, but it actually links to really some really great abstract preparation guides and videos that Purdue University actually produced. And so a lot of these libraries talk to each other and really share resources and really have great sort of resources for how to write abstracts, in addition to a lot of other things that you'll need to do. And then lastly, I think there are some other online guides. I did want to give a shout out to Food Science and Technology Abstracts. Even though they don't actually have a specific abstract writing guide, they have a lot of really other great content. If you look at their publishing guide, that can help you through the process of finding a journal, as well as being able to go about writing a review, especially systematic reviews can be a challenge if you're asked to write one of those. So that's actually a good resource that I would recommend. And then especially if you're writing for submission to a journal, always look at the guide for authors of the specific journal itself. Usually they have a good sort of guide as to what they're looking for in an abstract and how it should be, should be a structured, unstructured abstract. What's the word limit? Really consulting the guide for authors. It seems kind of obvious, but it really can help out. And so that was pretty much all I had related to abstracts. I think we're going to save questions for the end, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? Thank you, Dr. Moore, for that interesting presentation. My name is Ogechukwu Tasie, and I'll be presenting today on the importance of using effective visuals to create a compelling presentation. And this will be the outline that I'll follow for this presentation today. So let's ask ourselves, why do we even talk about, visuals? Like Dr. Moore talked about abstract, right? Sometimes it's hard for us to fit in our abstracts in certain number of words. So the same way with visuals, we have so much data, right? With the rise of the AI and everything, we have so much data coming up. But how are we going to make our data to make sense? How are we going to impact people with our data? So when we talk about visuals, we are talking about, charts, tables, graphs, how to utilize them to present our data. Imagine in a presentation without a chart or a table. I don't know how it's going to be, right? It will be, sometimes it may be difficult for us to follow through. So there's a popular saying that, 80%, of people will remember about 80% of what you say, of what they see, versus 20% of what they read, right? Because we tend to, assimilate more, right? Visually when we see it. So it helps to capture attention, and understand ideas more fully. So according to statistics, it has shown that about 65% of people are visual learners, because the brain tends to process image, better and faster. So it's very important for us to utilize, as students, as professionals, to utilize engaging visuals, in our presentation, depending on the presentation, school or maybe IFT or conferences. We have to, look at great visuals that we can use to tell our story. So like I just said, imagine, telling a student, trying to describe something to a student and maybe telling the student about a three-sided polygon that consists of edges and vertices. The students may be, a friend, they may be confused, if I say that. We'll put the graphics right here, like the triangle, it will be easier, or a circle, or whatever that you are trying to convey, it will be easier for the person to understand. So there's power in visuals. Visuals help us to understand effectively, enhance our understanding, right? It helps us to simplify complex problems. It helps to capture attention. There are some, like I teach, some undergraduate classes, some students, some of them get bored easily, right? So you have to find ways, you have to find different, visuals, audios, to make them understand, to make that capture their attention and all that. So increasing engagement when you do that, and also creates connection, because you are telling a story, with your data. Also retaining, information. So like here, I put like a tomato, like I'm teaching spoilage of foods and trying to let them understand, putting a spoiled tomato as well as, a good tomato to make that difference. So these are just showing some examples of visuals that we can utilize in our presentation. We can use images such as some diagrams or pictures, and also use our data visualizations, our charts and our graphs, infographics, also trying to compress our data, right? Incorporating those charts, those tables, to make to tell a story, as well as videos. We can also put them in our presentations, or icons, little icons, small objects to just make sense immediately. And tables, although tables are not utilized mostly in visuals, but we use tables also in our papers, right? So we have to make sure that we are creating simple tables that will make sense, that will make difference, and make people to understand what we are trying to talk about. So this is just showing, when I defended my dissertation, I went to UGA to can, red kidney beans. So in my presentation, I incorporated some, some pictures in order to convey to my audiences what I'm actually, talking about, to make them understand. So this is just showing, cans and a retort. And this is also a picture of like a danger zone, where for safe food safety, telling students to make sure that they store their food appropriately away from the danger zone, to improve, food safety practices. And this is just showing different data visualizations that we can utilize. We can use graphs. We can also use charts, like our line graphs, our bar graphs, pie charts and flow charts. So for our graphs, if we are using a line graph, utilizes lines. You can see from this graph right here, it will make it, easier for people to understand. For example, a company that is trying to maybe look at their sales, their market, right, at the end of the year. So it's better for them to utilize this kind of line graph from January to December. So it makes them make informed decisions, right? And it also makes them to maybe project, what the next year or the next sales, time, is going to be. So like we can see from January, there were low sales, then, transcends to December where they saw. So it helps them to make predictions, right? So these are just simple line graphs that I made in Excel that we can also use to utilize our data, as well as a simple bar graph that also helps to, here we have rectangular bars, to represent our data. So trying to, compare the antioxidant levels, for different fruits, we can use like a simple bar graph right here. Like when an audience, even if the person is not familiar with what your research is all about, but by mere visually seeing this graph, they will be able to understand that blueberries had highest antioxidant levels, compared to other fruits. So in charts helps us to, describe like processes, step by step, way of how we do things, even though it doesn't really utilize, numerical data sometimes, but it shows like a chain in command, like in an organization, looking at hierarchy, maybe from the president to the provost. Or it can also represent a process, a workflow, like here. This is also from my dissertation, looking at like ways to can beans, what are the different steps, because sometimes you try to tell people, right? Sometimes they don't understand, or it may be harder. So we try to simplify it using these charts, to make sure that they understand, what you are saying. So we can also use flow charts. Then in pie chart, I know we see this for sensory scientists. During our sensory, most times we utilize pie charts, which shows the different percentages, right, according to consumer preferences. Like here, we are looking at what is the overall flavor, aftertaste of a product that we developed in our lab. And we had to conduct a sensory evaluation. And from that sensory evaluation, we use it to make our pie. So it makes, it's like a circle. It's a circle with different slices that gives different percentages of information. So it's very, very, these are just to show the different ways that we, depending on the data that you have, depending on the audience, like Dr. Moore said, too, will help you to decide, what kind of visuals that you're going to use for your presentation. And this is also showing an infographics, like I explained earlier, condensing data, trying to put them in a simple format. Example, like the 3-minute thesis for students, for dissertation, doctoral students and master students, where they are supposed to give like a 3-minute presentation to audience. And such cases or scenarios, you have to find ways to put everything together to condense your data, right? To make it make sense to people. So here they utilize charts, tables, put everything together, to make it easier and simpler for the audience and for people to understand. And I also used part of my research when I was doing my postdoctoral fellowship. I worked with hemp seeds, and here I was just showing, my raw materials subjected to sonication and the different, tests that I did, just to compress it. And here is also showing the nutrition plate where we can talk about the different fruits, grains, and bioactive carbs that we can consume. So it makes, consumers or people, easier for them to understand. And this is also showing a short clip, anime, during my dissertation. That's something that we can also use to present data. You can use animations for effects, to create that effect, engage our audiences, add like snippets of videos of what we do in our labs, right? To make our, audience or to make people understand what we are actually explaining. And like icons to different objects and pictures that will make sense easily, right? When we are presenting to convey ideas better. Like, for example, for young children, you can utilize if you're teaching them about electricity, or if you're teaching them about food, healthy food choices, you can use different icons, you can use smiley faces, you can use angry faces, those will help them to, be engaged in what you are trying to, convey to them. So this is just showing an example, of a table. Like if you are using a table as a visual representation, tables are organized in rows and columns, and we have to make sure that we label our tables here, and our column give them titles, as well as our body, the body and the footnotes of whatever we have to explain it better here. So we use it to report extensive data. When we have so much data, utilize tables to present them. And if we are citing them in paper, we give more details in the paper. So this is just showing, what is wrong with this table. Can someone tell me what is wrong with this table? I can call someone out. Johanna, can you tell me what is wrong with this table? Do you mind telling me?
I think it's not specific in the sex column.
Okay. Is there any other thing? Okay, you are very right. See, we, for table, when we're representing our data, right, we have to make sure that we are not using the rows and the vertical lines, the horizontal lines, because it can cause a distraction to the audience. We just have to make sure that we are simplifying our tables, make it easier for people to see, make sure that we put our captions on the top, and make sure that we label appropriately. So what are the different, best practices that we can utilize? Simplicity is always okay, right? It's always good to be simple, and clear, use colors that are, captivating and that are easy to read. Also be consistent. Use, choose the same style, consistent style design. It also help you, as well as making sure that your topic is aligned with the visuals are aligned with the topic that you are talking about. So don't deviate from your topic. Make sure you stay true to your topic, and make sure that the sizes, and are very appropriate and legible for people to see. So what are some of the tips? Like I said earlier, know your audience, right? Know the people Like if you're going to talk to the president, you have to know what to say, right? If you're going to talk to the children, you have to know what to say. So know your audience, because that will also spark their interest level as well as their understanding. Use engaging visuals, because at the end of the day, we are trying to tell a story, right? If we have all, like Dr. Moore said, we have all this data. Yes, even me sometimes it's hard, like, how am I going to make this data to make sense? What visuals am I going to utilize, right? So we have to make sure that we are engaging, using engaging visuals to tell our story. Also seeking feedback, from our peers, right? From our friends, like Dr. Moore also mentioned in his presentation. We don't know it all. Sometimes we think we know everything, but it's always good to have a second eye, right? To look at our presentation and make sure that we are doing well. So what are the benefits of using these effective visuals? When we use effective visuals, it will help to reinforce key messages, right? What is the message you are trying to pass along? It's going to stay true to them. It's going to enhance retention and understanding, as well as increasing engagement. So this is just a Venn diagram that I made, when we utilize effective communication, by using these visuals, right? And engagement, what is it going to do? It's going to enhance our understanding, improving retention. And like for students, some people are slow learners, sometimes it takes them, but they will get it, right? So it's going to help to improve their retention and remember the key points that you're trying to convey. And at the end of the day, what is the learning outcomes? What are we trying to get? We are having better retention rate, right? They remember what we are talking about. And it also supports diverse learning, making education, and learning more inclusive. So this is just, the same risk data, but you can see from the left slide, the left graph, sorry, is more clustered, right, compared to this. So we don't want to have all those noise. We just want to keep them, clean and easy for people to understand. So to reiterate, effective visuals are the backbone, of a compelling presentation, and it makes ideas more engaging as well as memorable. Remember this word, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? It sticks to our brain. So we have to make sure that we are utilizing effective visuals in order to create a compelling presentation. And these are some questions that I put together. How can someone share? I don't know if there's time, or this would be like our thoughts, what we have to think about, what other ways can we improve visuals for effective presentation? What are the tools and resources that will help us, as well as we agree that visual will actually, improve compelling, presentation. So that ends my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you, Dr. Tasie. I'll go ahead and take over. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right, cool. Well, hey everyone, my name is Sloane Stoufer, and I'm currently filling in for my lab mate, Christina Allingham, who's put together a really helpful presentation on best practices for when you're doing a research presentation to make sure it's accessible and understandable to everybody. So let's get into it. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is microphone practices. Generally, when you're giving a presentation, they're going to have a microphone available. I find you should always use that if they have one. I hear a lot of people saying like, oh, I don't need a microphone, I'm loud enough. That's never something you should assume. Like, you've never been in the audience for your own presentation. You don't know if the people in the back can hear you, okay? So always err on the side of caution and make sure you're using the microphone when it's available. In that same vein, for the question and answer segment, it's always a good idea to repeat the question using the microphone. So in a lot of Q&A segments, they'll have audience members either go up to a microphone or they'll pass one around, but it's still a good idea to repeat the question. And also another thing you want to be aware of when you're doing questions is be extra careful to avoid using jargon or using a lot of acronyms. Keep in mind, when you're giving the actual presentation, you're going to have visual aids, you're going to have your slides to supplement the words, what you're saying, but you're not going to be able to rely on that when you're answering questions. You might not always have a visual aid that matches up. So it's always important to be extra clear when you're answering the questions and extra concise. All right, next up, inclusive language. This should be a no-brainer, but definitely want to avoid any discriminatory language, avoid any verbal comments related to gender, sexual orientation, disability, etc. Just want to make sure you're always using the proper terms for everything. All right, next up, let's get into some presentation slide practices. So contrast is really important when you're making your presentation slides legible. You always want to make sure you're using really high contrast and always making sure that the content is relevant. You don't want to overload your slides. So a good general rule of thumb when you're picking out slide and text colors is if you put the slide in grayscale and everything is still legible, then you're probably okay. If you put in grayscale and it becomes hard to read, then you probably want to adjust the colors, adjust the contrast a little bit more. Also, it's good to make sure that only the relevant information is present on your slide. I know you can be tempted to include a lot of stuff, but keep in mind your audience is going to be trying to take in all the information that's on your slide while they're trying to absorb everything you're saying. So it's important to make sure the information on your slide is very relevant. And this is both for you and for your audience. Don't rush. Try and relax, slow down, and speak at a reasonable pace so everybody has time to kind of process everything you're saying while processing all the information that you've got up on your slides. All right, next up, let's talk about commercialism. So sometimes this can be unavoidable if you're working with like specific products or using a specific brand, but you want to avoid excessive use of brand names. Like you don't need to talk about the brand names of all the materials or reagents that you're using in your project. Now, this can sometimes be unavoidable if you're, say, doing a collaboration with a company or whatever. So I would check in with your collaborators and your co-authors to see like what information you can include, what information is good to include, and what you should cut out. But the company name and the company information should never be the focal point. You should always focus on what the actual product or material you're doing is and what it does, how it's relevant to the study that you were doing or the work that you've done. All right, next up, slide layouts. You want to try and keep it simple. We've all probably seen slides before that were way too dense and it was hard to figure out what the key information is. I think it would be good to jot down some of the information that she's got in the avoid section here, the number of slides per section or number of blocks per section or lines per section. Just so if you're working on a slide and you think maybe it's getting a little too busy, you don't know if it's time to like cut some things or break it up into another slide, it's good to refer back to this and see like how much is too much. Similarly, background practices. The contrast thing is important again, and referring back to the grayscale rule, I think is a good one here. You want to make sure that there's a lot of contrast between the background color and the text color. Some people are going to be tempted to like make the slides really pretty, use a lot of colors, make it really interesting. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but your first priority should always be making sure the slide is easy to understand. Also, I would generally avoid image backgrounds. I feel like no matter what text color you're using, it's going to be hard to read. So I would just pass on that one. All right, and text practices, this I think would be another thing to jot down is some good like font size ranges that you can use. So like for headings, either 32 points or above, subheadings maybe around 30-point font, and text 18 to 28. I would not go below 18. The one exception to this, I'd say, would be, say, if you were using a figure from like some online source or from someone else's study and you needed to include the citation on the slide, then you could go below 18-point font, but that is the only situation I would say. Also, you want to be using sans serif fonts like Arial, which she used here, or Helvetica, something like that. Serif fonts, for those that don't know, are the ones that have the little points on them. So like Times New Roman, for example, is a serif font. That's something you want to avoid for presentations. It just makes the text a little busier than we need it to be. We want everything to be very clear. Also, if you want to highlight any text points, I would go with bold rather than italicizing things or underlining things, just because it makes it a little easier to read. All right, animations, particularly slide transitions, you can totally do these. In fact, I think it's a great way to make your slides a little more visually interesting, get the viewers interested again, because movement draws the eye, we all know. You just want to make sure that like you don't go overboard with it. Don't do the one where like the slides start spinning around when it comes in. Just do like sliding in from the left or something like that. And video practices, if you want to include a video in your presentation, you totally can. But first of all, make extra sure before you give your presentation that the video is going to play properly, because we've all seen people have issues with this. And second, if there are people speaking in the video, if it's possible to include closed captions, you absolutely should. If not, make sure that there's a transcript available, because you don't know how the audio is going to come through in an actual presentation, and you don't know if there's going to be anybody hard of hearing in your audience. So you want to make sure that the key information from that video is easy to understand. And here, Christina has listed off a couple of resources for building your presentations. I'm sure you're all familiar with like PowerPoint and Google Slides, that kind of thing, but Canva and Prezi are also really good resources that you can find online to like help you make really visually interesting presentations. So you can totally use those. And also these are some other resources that you can use to make sure that the color schemes for your presentation are accessible, that people can, that like if there's anyone colorblind in your audience, they can still see everything really clearly, as well as some other resources. But this is what I've got, and hopefully this will help make your presentations not only more accessible, but also clearer, more professional, and more easy to understand for all your audience members. So thank you for listening.
Okay. I will wrap up with this session with preparing for a research competition. So building a lot on previous speakers, but focused on the actual research competition presentation. And just want to start out with why delivering an effective presentation matters, and why you might be nervous, or why it's valid to spend a lot of time preparing for these. First and foremost, it's a competition, assuming there's a prize or awards associated with that. Even if you're not a competitive person, it might be at a conference that you would otherwise use as an opportunity to network for a job, or for other potential collaborations or speaking opportunities, or even for funding purposes. Or perhaps, this is the culmination of work that you've been doing for the past however many years, trials and tribulations and successes, boiling this down to the story of your life so you could explain to your family, what you do. And so you want to convey, effectively that work. And so I pulled together, just in my opinion, 4 best practices that or kind of qualities that successful presentations have, having been on the graduate student speaker side, but also having to serve as a judge for several different competitions. And so I think we have heard some of these already from the previous speakers, but first and foremost, generally best presentations are professional. The presenter is prompt, prepared, professionally presented, and polite. And there's probably other qualities of professionalism you could think of, but in general, coming across as serious about the work and the opportunity and the presentation, and coming off as professional is impactful. Secondly, incorporating an appropriate level of detail, including what's critical for credibility and communication, as well as balancing text with visuals. So I think we've already heard a great number of practices and tips around text and slide organization and visuals, so I won't dwell on that too much. Best presentations are focused on impact as well, highlighting why the work matters, what it contributes to the field, or advancing our knowledge, or whatever the impact might be relevant to the audience. This isn't to say that the most impactful work always wins or is the best, but you could be missing out having a great, well-rounded scientific presentation, but missing that impact often leaves the audience or the judge with the kind of so what kind of question. So focusing on the impact. And then also we've heard threads of this throughout, from preparing the abstract for the competition and slides and all those considerations. Best presentations are clear and concise. It just facilitates that, like Dr. Tasie said, a retention of information, recall, and understanding. So these are the kind of 4 best practices, and I'm going to walk through 4 is my number of today. So 4 kind of steps of how you might incorporate these as you prepare for your presentation. The first one is understanding the context. So I guess, you might be doing presentations in many different reasons, but I guess the context of this webinar is assuming that this is a competition. And so likely this is at a research symposium where there's going to be back-to-back presentations on a related topic, and therefore judges are going to be evaluating you and all the other presentations. Regardless of the context, I still want to communicate that these 4 best practices are very important, but how you effectively implement those might be different if it's, for example, a poster competition or presentation versus an oral presentation that's in person and it's a technical audience or technical setting. Or these days, there are also a lot of virtual settings. And so things that might differ across these is professionalism. Things in a virtual setting that get really distracting are, sound in the background or your background on your screen. Whereas in-person events, how you are presented, maybe fidgeting or other kind of body signs come across as less professional. Appropriate level of detail also differs if you're, stuck with a poster or you're enabled to have different slides. Same thing with clear and concise. So understanding the context might help you implement these best practices. Secondly, following the instructions. So again, there's judges that they're having to run through many presentations. And so there's likely a standard format for the competition, for the presentation that aligns with the judging criteria that you're going to be evaluated on. And so just give yourself those easy points. If there are stated rules and requirements, follow them. So I think this goes with writing abstracts and papers and writing grants. Make sure you read the guidelines ahead of time and just follow those. So things that came to my mind, poster size, whether you need section headers or references are required, slide limits, time limits, probably, others depending on the context of the competition, but make sure that if those are outlined that you follow those, because those, again, will be easy things that the judge can just check off. And then beyond that, you want to be creative, but again, due to the fact that judges are going to have to evaluate a lot of different research presentations, it's generally good to follow typical organization of research to tell your story, which includes kind of framing your title from the beginning very concisely. First thing that the audience level, okay, what are we about to hear about? And then following a similar format that we've already heard today, of background, introduce the topic and the aims or hypotheses or your objectives, summarize the methodology in a way that's appropriate, highlight, your results effectively as they support the overall conclusion that you're trying to drive home. So again, this will help a judge or an audience follow the story and the research that you're trying to present. Other criteria may include style that we've already heard from other presenters, obviously the content, as well as your presentation. And I have a little bit more on that in the next slide. So getting into the appropriate level of detail and focus on the impact of your work. We have already heard of this as well, but knowing your audience, I think, will help influence how you structure the presentation. So for example, this comes up a lot in some of the areas that I evaluate or judge. Don't necessarily need to waste time on a really lengthy introduction, justification, or background if everyone in your audience or if the conference is already very specific to one topic. And I think Dr. Moore mentioned this as well. Just simply state the gap that you're focused on, or the simple piece of that area that's relevant, as opposed to going way back in time and elaborating, because you might not have time or space to do that. Same thing goes with methodology and figures and results. Knowing the level of detail or explanation that's needed is going to vary depending on the background and diversity of your audience. What to focus on as the impact of the work, I think, will differ if you're talking to an industry-led kind of audience versus an academic or scientific audience versus a general public audience. But trying to highlight, again, focus on the impact of the work for those appropriate audiences is going to be what they're left with at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, being prepared for questions is difficult, but perhaps if you understand, or to the best of your knowledge, anticipate who is in the audience or who the judges are, you can try to anticipate and try to prepare kind of talking points or confident answers that you could deliver during the Q&A. And then lastly, practice, practice, practice. It is quite obvious to judges and audiences, which presentations have been practiced and refined and honed, and which ones haven't. So practicing to the extent possible is going to improve your presentation every time. It's going to improve your delivery, your engagement with your audience, and your confidence. And again, this comes back to the professionalism and clear and concise language that you use on the fly, so that you're not simply reading off slides, but also still not introducing more and more jargon as you go. Practicing in front of a small audience or your peers is best, but at a minimum, you should at least run through your presentation alone and time yourself and realize where you get stuck and where you drift off topic. So that's what I had, and I know we were kind of out of time, but I am on the Student Relations Committee of Phi Tau Sigma, so I wanted to take just 30 seconds in case there are student members or non-members in the audience to just communicate opportunities for students in Phi Tau Sigma, the benefits of being a member. So I know I'm switching gears a little bit before we jump to questions, but if you're looking for any opportunities to get more involved, or to apply for scholarships, or to get resources around your professional development, definitely check out website, or feel free to contact Elizabeth is our president, or myself to get more information. And here's links to our website, our LinkedIn page, and also YouTube channel, which has all of the past webinar links. So with that, I'll stop sharing and open it up for, I guess, questions from the audience, if there's any, or from other panelists, I guess.
If anyone in the audience has any questions, we're happy to take them now. I know we don't have a ton of time. There's been a lot of great information presented today, and I know that going online and reviewing this will be a great repository for our members and for guests. But could I ask that the speakers to provide your one key takeaway from what you gave? You guys presented a lot of great information, but now that you hear everyone talking, what's one last thing you want to share? Dr. Moore, let's start with you.
That's a good question. I would say just really, there's a lot of resources out there, and I think a lot of people are afraid to ask. So don't be afraid to go to your peers as well as your advisor and seek help or seek advice from as many people as possible. I guess that would be my advice. Like, there's a lot of resources out there, and you tend not to get as many people that try and utilize all of them.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Tasie?
Thank you. I can also say practice, practice, practice. Practice makes perfect. So don't give up on yourself. Just try. We didn't start, I wasn't like this. I started from somewhere. So just try and believe in yourself. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Stoufer?
I would say my biggest advice is for presentations, keep it simple and straightforward. Always make sure that the most essential information is the easiest thing to understand on every slide. I know it can be tempting to cram in a lot more detail, but if people want to know more, they can totally ask you, and that'll just be a question that you definitely know how to answer. So yeah, keep those key points very clear.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Zoellner.
Yeah, I think I'll put a slight spin on Dr. Tasie's. Yeah, don't let fear keep you back from just putting yourself out there in these competitions or these presentations. You'll always learn something out of a presentation, and the more you talk about your work in different settings, you'll refine your storytelling capabilities, and it's a really fun part of all the work you're doing is to share that with other people. So think
I
about that.
agree. Thank you. I mean, you're right. Everyone is presenting for the first time sometime, right? And you guys, whoever you are, you're the one who knows the most and most knowledgeable about your research. So it's a great opportunities. I want to thank our speakers once again. We really appreciate you sharing your information and knowledge with our members today. And thank you to the audience for being here and supporting the Phi Tau Sigma webinar series. Coming up in January is the kickoff to our next portion of the series, where we have Dr. Singh with application of cold plasma in food processing. The registration link for this could be found on our Phi Tau Sigma website page, as well as in the Phi Tau Sigma newsletter. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you for the opportunity. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.